listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to BBC journalist and author Richard Fisher.
The possibility that the end is nigh is something that I worry about, but I'm optimistic that it is possible to take a longer view, and it is possible for the next generation to do things better than our one.
Richard shared his thoughts on the importance of taking a long view of the future, why short-termism is the greatest threat to civilization, and how metaphors are key to our comprehension of time. At the core of your book is thinking about this idea of generations. The next generation, as you say in the book, might conceivably live to the 22nd century, but why does that sometimes feel so unlikely?
We're human beings. We think in terms of our own lifespan. I think one of the things that changed my point of view, and I kind of opened the book with, is reflecting on my relationship with my daughter and thinking about how far her life might reach, far beyond my own. So, she was born in 2013, and, in the sleep-addled state that I was in at the time, I started to think about how long she might actually end up living. And It was nice to think about the fact that she could actually see the next century. She'll be 86 or 87 years old when the fireworks go off and Auld Lang Syne is sung at the start of a whole new century. And that thought kind of blows my mind. If you think about it that way, in terms of like the links between other people in your family and the generational ties that we have, you can reach back in time. You think back to your parents and their parents, and you're just a hop, skip and a jump from the Victorian age, and then you go back in further, 17th century. We're much closer to past times and futures than we think through the generational ties that we have. We live in a time when short-term thinking and the focus on the present is everywhere. So it's not surprising that we don't necessarily always think that way.
I think that was one of the things that really came to mind after reading your book, The Long View, was this idea of the fact that we don't really talk about the 22nd century. I think it was William Gibson who said, we've got so much focus on the 21st century, but when it comes to the idea of the 22nd century, we often think we're not going to get there because of all the present crises.
Yeah, that's true. There is a lot of talk of perma-crisis or polycrisis at the moment. And I mean, certainly there are lots of threats that we face. It's possible. I spent a lot of time talking to people who focus on extinction risk for the book, thinking about like kind of the long-term future. That there's many threats that we face now in this century, like artificial intelligence, nuclear Armageddon, biotechnology. All these things didn't emerge for previous generations, and they're uniquely kind of dangerous for us. That said, like, species are resilient. There's certainly the possibility of disasters down the track, but I'm optimistic personally that we'll see the next century. I think the key more is like, are we handing a world to the next generation that is better than the one we inherited? Are we being the good ancestor that Jonas Salk talked about? William Gibson actually, incidentally, has influenced a lot of my thinking in other ways. I think his quote about the future being already here is just unevenly distributed. That influences a lot of my journalism and the things I do at the BBC, my writing. But yeah, the possibility that the end is nigh is something that I worry about. But I'm optimistic that it is possible to take a longer view, and it is possible for the next generation to do things better than our one.
Well, let's start at the beginning. What does it mean to take a longer view of the future?
So I think one thing that I suppose I learned through the process of researching and writing the book is that there are multiple long views. It's plural, really. There's many different approaches to taking the long view. I started from the point of view of geology. At university, I studied geology. I was fascinated by rocks. I recently went back to the place I did my geology dissertation in France, where I spent 6 weeks out in the field, like tracking kind of like fossils and strata and so on. And so that kind of scientific long view is something that's always fascinated me, that sense of deep time. But researching the book, I met various other different people. I met artists kind of extending their perspectives into the past and the future, historians, philosophers who've come up with a new kind of mode of moral thinking called long-termism, which we probably want to talk about later. There's kind of indigenous worldviews, like the idea of seventh generation thinking, a Native American principle of thinking about like 7 generations into the future. The question, what is the long view? The answer is there's lots of long views. There's lots of different ways to approach it. And that's something that I think is quite important to consider. I really believe that long view should be democratic, that everyone should be able to approach the long view with their own perspective in their own way. And I'm always learning about new long views that I didn't know about before.
Well, back here in the present, why do you think it's so hard to have a long view, to have a long-term vision for the future? Why, perhaps, do you think we've become so blinkered to the long arc of time?
So there's no single cause. This was another starting point for me. I wrote a piece for the BBC a few years ago called "The Perils of Short-Termism: The Greatest Threat Facing Civilization" was the headline, I think. And that was the starting point for me thinking about like what are the external pressures and psychological habits that trap us in the present. So that there's myriad different external pressures. There's technology, the internet, the law of going onto Twitter. There's the kind of 24-hour news cycle. There's also kind of incentives and deterrents that exist within companies and within politics. So politicians have 4-year or 2 or even sometimes 2-year kind of election cycles. Terms. Businesses have the quarterly report that they have to put out 4 times a year. These targets encourage a short-term horizon. That's one of the examples that I look at in the book about the external pressures. I call them temporal stresses in the book. But there's also kind of like psychological habits that we are, a species that has, probably not yet caught up with the evolutionary kind of legacies that we've left behind, our ancestors had. It makes sense that we focus on the present a lot of the time, that we're not thinking about the very long-term past or future. Long-term past and future is a relatively recent discovery. Deep time wasn't something that people 1,000 years ago really thought about. They mainly thought about the present or the subsequent or previous generations. So we're just kind of catching up with this, and we have these kind of psychological habits, ways of thinking. Just to give you an example, we talk about the future using certain adjectives. We tend to think about it in terms of space, like as a landscape. So people use the word far future or distant past. Now that way of equating time with space means that the future is always far away, somewhere over the horizon. So if we want to think about the far future, like maybe we should use the language of that's not always of distance. Thinking about it I prefer the term deep future. It's still a space adjective, but it's not placing it distant from the self. I think that's an example of many of the psychological habits that we have. As I say, there's no simple silver bullet or lever that we can pull that make us think long term, but I think there are kind of routes towards it. So I'm optimistic that it's possible to do that.
Well, that was so clear in the book and so clear in the work that we have these metaphors to describe time, and the metaphors reveal the way in which we treat time. And you've tried to develop some new metaphors, some new neologisms. You mentioned one there, temporal stresses, but there's also this thing called temporal habits. So what are they and how do they function together?
Well, so I suppose temporal habits is the collective term for the kind of the psychological, the modes of thinking that we have that are worth knowing about if you want to extend your mind into long-term timescales. So I mentioned the kind of the distancing effect. That's known as construal level theory within the psychological literature. But there are others. So some of the better known ones are things like shifting baseline syndrome, which is the habit that we have of just assuming that the present way of things is the way that they've always been. So it was coined by a fisheries scientist, Daniel Pauly, who pointed out that fisheries scientists, even those who study the oceans, were kind of looking at the ocean and thinking, this is the population of tuna, of fish that exists in the sea that has always been there. But, speak to your grandparent and they'll tell you that the ocean used to be very different. I mean, another kind of well-known example is flies on windscreens. So my daughter has no idea that on long car journeys, when I was a kid, the windscreens used to be kind of coated with flies, but now insect populations have declined so much that, it's less clear that was once the case. that's just another example of like a way that we think about time in the mind that kind of shapes how we think about past, present, and future. There are others as well. The people have different temporal perspectives. Some people are more future oriented. Some people are more past oriented. Across the psychology literature that I studied for the book, I found various different ways that time manifests differently within the mind. Time, I guess, if you're from a physics point of view, exists out there in the world, but time within the mind is a translation of sorts. And so that way that the brain processes it and thinks about it, and how we then make decisions based on that's going to shape how we think about the past, present, and future.
Well, it does feel like there is an emergence of the future, because our ancestors, they thought very differently about time, didn't they?
Yeah. So, I mean, just on a very basic level, clocks didn't exist thousands of years ago, so you can look back in time and you can find examples of how new technologies that were introduced, how they started to change people's behaviors. There's a line from an ancient Greek play about a person who is cursing the sundials because the sundials, when they were introduced in the town that he lives in, meant that meal times had to be defined at a certain time. He wasn't thinking in terms of like when he ate when he wanted, rather than kind of like having a fixed meal time. Otherwise, like beyond that, things like clocks and synchronized time early on certainly in Western civilization were it was controlled by the church. There were churches that had the clocks on, and that was kind of like a religion view of time. If you look back at the Middle Ages, there is a sense that kind of people saw time as more cyclical than linear. So, it was about rise and fall of kingdoms, like seasons, like the sowing of harvests. There wasn't a sense that time is moving forward on a trajectory. It was that it repeats. So when people talk about things like cathedral thinking, which is, it's often held up as a kind of example of long-term thinking. Cathedral thinking is the idea that people who build something often didn't finish it, and they would pass on the job to the next generation to finish the cathedral. A lot of people say we should embrace cathedral thinking, do it more in the present day. The downside of that, or the thing that makes it hard, is that things are moving so much faster, and the lives of people who were living in the Middle Ages when cathedrals were being built in this way, their children were not going to have a completely different life to theirs. It was going to be roughly the same. So it was easier to pass the baton or imagine the world that the cathedral would be finished in. The pace of change nowadays is a little harder. More recently, even things like the timeline, right? So the timeline was invented by somebody. So the idea that time runs from left to right on an x-axis, which we all learn at school, that wasn't always the case. Graphs didn't always exist, like timelines didn't always exist. And so we have these kind of like cultural inventions and technologies like the clock that have shaped how we think about time. And that mediation of time subsequently affects our choices.
I do like your breakdown of cathedral thinking, because it's often used as an example of this idea of thinking long term. But as you reveal in the book, actually cathedral thinking is a lot more complicated, and mainly due to poor workmanship sometimes.
That's true, yeah. I mean, there's a kind of survivorship bias about cathedrals, as in people look at how wonderful they are in the present day, but lots of cathedrals collapsed or were badly built. So we shouldn't always assume that our predecessors did everything right.
Listening to you speak there, it does feel like timescapes, they've been almost invented, and they've been invented by either culture, society, religion, or in some cases, industry.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was another kind of turning point in our understanding of time. So Lewis Mumford, the historian, famously wrote that the most important invention of the industrial age wasn't necessarily the machine in any way, it was the clock, because clocks could synchronize people. And it meant that people started work and ended work at the same time. And that sense that of the 9 to 5 and shifts shaped the industrial culture completely, and has done ever since. The way that kind of capitalism has intersected with time over the past 200 to 250 years, I think is definitely worth thinking about more deeply. The book doesn't argue for dismantling capitalism, but I do think there are kind of pressures within capitalism that do discourage long-term thinking. And people who are in business and industry know that very well. I mean, there's organizations like the Boston-based Future Capital for the Long Term. There's kind of leaders like the CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman. There's various different people within senior levels of industry that recognize that things like the quarterly report are a problem. And that does foster short-term thinking amongst leaders and managers.
Well, that also infects the metaphors that we use to think about time. The idea of spending time has become so dominant since capitalism has captured the notion of time and also invented different notions for time. But I think one of the most overarching influences, I guess, on time is this idea of religion, and religion specifically in the West, because religion, to some degree, it invented the end of time.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so the idea of the apocalypse, and so when I was researching this book, I was based at MIT at the time. I did a fellowship, took a sabbatical from the BBC, and took a class. It was one of the most interesting classes I've ever done. It was about the apocalypse in kind of culture and how it was invented and how it emerged across various different religions, around 2,000 years ago. Certainly the idea that like we could face extinction is something that is hasn't always been around. I suppose apocalyptic thinking is slightly different to total extinction, as in because even with the apocalypse there was the idea of like the world would end, but you'd go on to a timeless existence in heaven. So it's not the end of time; it's more kind of a great change, and then followed by transcendental kind of infinite time of some kind. So it's not quite the same as like everything coming to an end, but yeah, I certainly think that sense of like where human beings fit on the timeline is something that religion has influenced for many years. I mean, the most well-known example is James Ussher, the bishop in 1600s, decided to kind of date the age of the earth, went back through the lives of the Old Testament and counted the generations literally to see how old the earth was. And I think his estimate was around 6,000 years, I think. Yeah. But then a century later, James Hutton, the geologist, came along and showed that it was actually millions and millions, tens of millions of years old. And so in a way, that was the kind of religion loosening its grip on time around that period, the 1700s. There were geological discoveries which showed that a young Earth just simply wasn't possible. There had to be kind of tens of millions of years for the rocks to have formed that geologists were observing. And so that was the kind of the decline of the religious lens on time, and I suppose the growth of the scientific and the capitalist lens on time.
Well, it does feel like our perception of time is very much characterized by the conditions of the present, and that usually defines whether we're utopian or dystopian about what may happen in the future. So how do you think the present impacts our choice of how we characterize what the past may look like, whether utopian or dystopian?
If you look back in history, you can read about people looking into the future and the past. Just to illustrate with an example, H.G. Wells was kind of a very famous future gazer. In many ways, he got things right. He looked ahead to this century and wrote about machines that we're not a million miles away from what we actually have. But he also got so much wrong. He social change, for example. He was unable to see that some of the things that he admired would end up being kind of used by the Nazis in the Second World War. That he was unable to see that women are just as smart as men, and there were many people in that period that kind of thought eugenics was a good idea. And it was kind of like a mainstream idea, and so it's always worth approaching kind of the long-term view with a healthy dose of humility. There's almost certainly known unknowns and unknown unknowns that kind of color our view of past, present, and future. So that's why I think that having multiple long views is important. I think that's one criticism of kind of having a singular long view, say a technology-rooted long view, or a kind of very kind of like strict, like moralistic long view is that it's inevitably going to be colored by the present. Taking the long view should actually suggest to you that you shouldn't try and predict the future too much, because past evidence suggests that you are going to get it wrong.
Well, it feels like in our current present that we struggle to take this long view. In actual fact, short-term thinking is really the thing that defines the way in which society is currently operating, and you call that being in a time-blinkered age. So what do you think are some of the dangers of taking that perspective in the 21st century?
I think that the dangers should hopefully be clear. As in, it's like wearing a blindfold on the edge of a cliff. It's kind of there are so many threats now that we face that are coming down the line, but act slowly, or that require some foresight to see coming. The most obvious is climate change, right? So we've known about that for a very long time, but have failed to act in so many different ways. And that's because like present day considerations often take precedence. So it's hard. You have to make sacrifices in the present that benefit your future self, or even not even your future self, but like the future generations that are not even born yet. And that's a challenge. I think there have always been dangers that the kind of generations have faced that they are coming down the line. I suppose, like, as I was listening to a radio show about the Black Death the other day, and and that kind of like hit people in Europe without them even realizing it was coming. And so we do at least know much more clearly like how diseases spread. But new threats are emerging all the time. Artificial intelligence is a good one, right? So like that's something that is hard to conceive of now, but has great potential for danger and catastrophe. No matter where you sit on the spectrum of kind of it's an existential risk down to just it's a danger that could allow for inequality to be extended. There's many different points of view about what the actual risks are of AI, but I think it's pretty undeniable that there are risks, and we need to kind of like step outside the present to try and imagine how they might play out if we're going to avoid them.
In that case, how do we do this long-term thinking? What are some of the ways in which society can embrace the long view when so many of the challenges we face feel rather immediate?
For me, it starts with like the everyday. It starts with thinking about the kind of the deep time that surrounds us, like the long-term history. I live in London. You walking along the street, you see like geological strata and roadworks. There's long-term time there, and then there's like you look at the future generations that exist in schools who are not yet born yet. The children that are going to inherit the planet from us. So these are all ways that I think in the everyday we can access a long-term view.
So in other words, you think there's perhaps some mental shortcuts that we can use to begin to think long term?
I think so, yeah. I think it's easy to think about the long view as being this abstract thing that exists, or to think about the future as being far away or distant. But the future won't be far away or distant. It'll be here. It'll be right in the same place, your neighborhood, the country that you live in. Everything is going to play out in the same place geographically. It's just temporally distant. So yeah, I think there are kind of shortcuts. So I do. There's a lot of things I try and do. Like when I go on a hike, I try and pick up a rock and keep it. It's just a little souvenir of like the places that I've been. And it's just a way of collecting deep time artifacts. So that's my own approach. But I think there's many other different things I've seen other people doing. I've seen people do more ritualistic things. A project I particularly like is the Future Library, which was founded by the artist Katie Patterson. So every year an author contributes a book to that project that won't be published until the year 2114. No one will read it until then. It's kept in a library in Oslo, and then will be printed on trees from a forest north of the city. The thing that makes that more of a ritual is that every year the book is handed over within the forest where the trees are growing. And so, I went to Oslo to kind of see this ceremony, and it involved kind of Tibetan singers and Norwegian kind of like choirs. It was a lovely event with like people walking their dogs, children on their shoulders. About 200, 300 people turned up, like all drinking coffee and eating kind of donuts. It was a way of kind of marking our relationship with future generations. And because they do it every year, it becomes a kind of like regular ritual that allows people to kind of like come together and think beyond the present. Sometimes some people say to me that like art projects, what's the point of them? How do they actually kind of get us to think long term? But I always point to that one. Like the Future Library is a way of kind of bringing people together to think about the past, present, and future in a ways that they wouldn't normally do.
Well, there's also some policy things that we can do, and part of that is related to how we think about future generations and how do we account for future generations. So what are some of the ways we're using to think about future people and bring them into present?
There are specific political efforts that have been going on. There are examples like like Wales established a Future Generations Act and appointed a Future Generations Commissioner. And so the aim of that commissioner is to just remind, nudge, prod politicians and policymakers that future generations should be included within their kind of policy decisions. And so when you look at what the actual policy decisions are, it's not kind of grand futures stuff. It's often things like, we cancelled the bypass around the A42, because it was better to have a public transport network than it was to have a new road. But the point is that future generations are not included within current kind of political considerations because they can't vote, and so there's no lobby group for future generations. And so the aim of a Future Generations Commissioner is to remind politicians that this exists, and it's a model that I think its power lies in the fact that it can be replicated. And so other jurisdictions, like the House of Lords, have debated it. Lord Bird, the founder of the Big Issue, was greatly influenced by the Wales example, and tried to introduce a House of Lords bill to focus on future generations. I think that those kinds of like on the ground policy proposals can actually work. It's practical. It's not kind of high level deep time stuff. It's just future generations are there and they're going to exist, and we need to think about their needs when we kind of make decisions that affect both present and the future.
Well, then I guess it's a question of how do we account for future generations?
To answer that question, one thing that I learned through the psychology research is that it's easier to imagine a future person if you individualize them than if you start talking about statistics. So you can do things like add up the number of future people. You can say there's 11 million people born in a given year. But there's research, for example, on the process of perspective taking, it's called, where in one study, the researchers asked people to kind of imagine the effects of climate change in the future, say 100 years from now. And so one group was given kind of the high level scientific information, 1 degree temperature rise equals kind of this amount of wildfires. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially, it was kind of statistics and kind of top level stuff. The other group were given like the story of a specific person, Eleanor woke up in the morning and went outside and was sunburned very quickly. She went for a swim. The pollution in the water affected her skin. And they found that people were much more likely to engage with climate change afterwards. They measured this by they placed leaflets in the waiting room outside, and people were more likely to pick up a climate change leaflet afterwards, and through questionnaires. So that kind of like personalizing, it's also called the identifiable victim effect. That's one way of thinking about future people to make them crystalline, make them into a person rather than a statistic.
Well, one other way is do the mathematical work, and sometimes it's been described as mathematical blackmail, but when you think about the amount of future generations there could possibly be, sometimes that's the argument for why we need to think long term. Yeah,
so this approach of like adding up future generations in terms of the numbers that exist is one that is most commonly associated with long-termism, which is a mode of thinking about the future that's emerged from the movement called effective altruism over the past few years. There's calculations which suggest that there could be 100 trillion people living in the future. I did some similar calculations for the BBC a few years ago before I came across long-termism, where I looked at kind of like how many people have lived and died over the past 50,000 years. That's about 100 billion. Like, how many people are alive today? There's 8 billion people. How many people, if the current birth rate stays steady, could exist over the next 50,000 years? And it adds up to 6.7 trillion. So, 6.7 trillion, 100 trillion, these are all absolutely massive numbers. They're often kind of highly, highly uncertain. How can we know like what the birth rates will be in the future? We don't know what they're going to be by the end of the century. But it's a way of thinking about the obligations that we hold to future people. So the key argument underpinning long-termism is, future people matter. There could be a lot of them, and it's within our gift to kind of do something about it. I think that's kind of in its most basic form. That's makes sense to me. I think the problem comes, and where it gets a bit controversial, is that's the mathematical blackmail. The issue of kind of if there's 100 trillion people in the future, but only 8 billion today, then on the scales of who's more important, the 100 trillion seems to win. And it's a very utilitarian way of thinking, but it's, that's the danger, the peril of starting to think that way. You start to weigh people's needs against each other.
I mean, since launching the book, long-termism, it's been getting a bit of a bad rap, especially with how crypto controversy has been tied to effective altruism. And a lot of the critics say that really long-termism is about abandoning the present for some imagined future. What do you think of some of that criticism?
I mean, gosh, yeah. I mean, it's been tumultuous, hasn't it? I mean, I don't think any of the people involved with it expected any of it. And who could have expected that one of the key donors and the key supporters of long-termism, Sam Bankman-Fried, would be arrested and, and is now facing court cases in the US. But even without that kind of cryptocurrency controversy, like there was already criticism of long-termism, both from people in academia and people on the internet. I think some of the criticism gets quite personal. I'm less convinced by the critiques that are kind of like these people are attached to techno billionaires that are based on kind of like the personal kind of like ideologies of the individuals rather than kind of like what the actual arguments are. The critiques are, I do think hold weight that come from the philosophers and the academics, so there's people like David Thorstad, who he happens to work in the same building as many of the long-termists in Oxford, but he writes a blog called Reflective Altruism, where he writes some very clear, cogent responses to what are the problems with the kind of like the moral mathematics that underpin long-termism. There's another piece I'd recommend by the philosopher Kiran Satya, who's based out at MIT. That he wrote a piece in the Boston New Review that kind of like looked at the kind of the population ethics. The one thing I think is worth knowing about long-termism for your listeners is that it comes in different flavors. And so, for example, there's weak long-termism, there's strong long-termism, there's patient long-termism, there's urgent long-termism. So there are different versions of it that require different kind of responses. So weak long-termism, for example, is the main argument that underpins McCaskill's book, What We Owe the Future. And future people matter. There could be a lot of them. We can do something about it. That's quite reasonable. You can go much further in the argument to strong long-termism. And so McCaskill has also written papers about how far long-termism could go, co-authored with Hilary Greaves, that strong long-termism is much more demanding. It's not just a moral priority of our time, it's the moral priority of our time, the number one. It supersedes all others. And so strong long-termism is usually what people are criticizing. It's kind of like, the slippery slope argument that kind of future people matter. There could be a lot of them, could slide into there's 100 trillion people. If we can reduce the probability of them the kind of like going extinct by 0.5%, then we should do it. No matter what the cost, even if it leads to kind of like dark decisions, like Marvel villain stuff about weighing up kind of like people's needs against each other. Yeah, I think sometimes people have if you think about how culture kind of like shapes how we think about utilitarian thinking, I think sometimes that kind of like is worth considering. I don't think. I mean, lots of the Marvel supervillains are often would be long-termists, so I don't think it's, think about like the Eternals, right? Is it that movie where? Sorry, I'm going to give some spoilers now, but like basically, like the central dilemma of the Eternals is that there's kind of like a creature that will give life to kind of trillions of people and seed whole new planets in the galaxy, but in order to do that, they have to destroy Earth and kill 8 billion people, and that's a kind of like a direct kind of fictional tale about like how future people might flourish on all these planets that exist, but in order to do that you have to kill somebody. It starts to get quite a trolley problem. Like, is it okay to kill 5 people if one person if you kind of say 5? And I think, and so many of the same problems that have kind of dogged philosophers for many years over kind of like what is the right thing to do in certain situations apply to long-termism, and people feel strongly about utilitarianism, and whilst not all long-termists are utilitarians, it has kind of influenced that approach, pretty clearly.
I always thought that fell on the more accelerationist approach, and there's this new term, effective accelerationism, which is kind of a response to effective altruism, which is really the question of how quickly you kill people in the present for the purpose of saving future generations, and whether those future generations even need to be people, even need to be humans. The question of whether AI shall inherit the earth is underpinning a little bit of the effective accelerationist group.
Yeah, I haven't come across them, but yeah, that sounds like adjacent to, because there are factions that exist within the effective altruism rationalist world, and the two are not always the same. And it's not always the case that all effective altruists are rationalists, and not all rationalists are transhumanists, and not all transhumanists are kind of was it effective accelerationists? So yeah, but they at least in internet forums, and often in departments like Oxford Future Humanity Institute, they often do sit just down the corridor. So that's part of the that fear that some critics have, just that transhumanist type, future oriented kind of, we're all going to be kind of half robot, half human. That's a real turn off for a lot of people, that mode of thinking, and it gets entwined with long-term thinking lots of the time.
Partly the problem is when we look towards the future, we all see a different thing. And in some cases, we look towards the future and we see a continuation of this thing called Western progress. And often, and more often in present day, it feels like the idea of progress has been replaced with the idea of crisis. When we look towards the future, we don't see the extension into the long term. We just see the end again.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the thing about the crisis mode of thinking is that it is sometimes a trap. I mean, it's definitely the case that we are kind of facing a lot of serious crises at the moment, but I think it's quite important to realize how crisis can trap us in the present. I wrote a piece about this for The Observer a few weeks ago, and it was about how that sense of polycrisis, if you immerse yourself in it all the time, you start to lose sight of any future at all, and crisis thinking can be a version of short-term thinking. We do face serious problems this century, but I think in terms of like the personal choices I try to make, I try not to kind of immerse myself too much in the daily news cycle. And I say that as I'm a journalist, I kind of have to, but I try and make more mindful choices now about the kind of media that I consume, so that I have a clearer picture of like how the world actually is changing. If you only read the daily news and nothing else, you can think that the world is falling apart. It's kind of, in many cases, the news is telling you like the important trends in history, but it's worth remembering that there's so much thing that's happening out there in the world that isn't picked up by the lens of what happened in the last 24 hours. There are slow changes. Things are, in many cases are getting worse, but in some cases things are getting better. The kind of child poverty rate, for example, is gradually getting better globally, as far as I know. The last time I checked the data, I think that those kinds of trends are worth knowing about, but they don't get picked up by the news. And so, before we assume that everything is falling apart, that we won't get to the end of the century, I think taking the long view means kind of thinking with a longer media diet, thinking about ways in which you can kind of like augment your information flow that's going into your brain. Like, what is it just telling you what's happening right now, or is it telling you the long view of like how things are changing from the past 10, 20, 30 years to the next century?
So in other words, we need to embrace new psychological habits to change our perception of time.
I think so. I think it's just as I say, there's no silver bullet, but like I think there's little tweaks. We're not completely like helpless in the face of all these pressures. We can make small mindful choices.
Well, on that note, Richard, what are you most hopeful for about the future?
I'm most hopeful when I see young people, when I hang out with my daughter, when I see kind of like the hopes and aspirations of the next generation coming through, when you see kindness or ingenuity or generosity within a kind of like a young person. I think that's what gives me hope for the next generation. Just the reminder that humanity is an intergenerational baton passing The people who are in charge now are not going to be in charge forever, simply because human lifespans don't last forever. Things can change, social change can improve. Things can get better. Of course, things can get worse, but I think that's what you asked about hope. I think it's the seeing what young people can do is the greatest source of hope for me.
Well, on that hopeful note, Richard Fisher, I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
Thanks so much. It's been really fun.
Thank you to Richard for showing us how we can recapture our far-sighted vision when thinking about the future. You can find out more by purchasing his book, The Long View: Why We Need to Transform How the World Sees Time, available now. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.